Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Modern Money Doughnuts, our show about ecological economics and modern monetary theory. My name is Gabrielle Bond, and I am an activist and organiser. I'm with the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group in Adelaide, South Australia, and I'm also working with Stephen at Modern Money Lab. How are you going, Stephen?
I'm going all right. How are you, Gabby?
Good, thank you.
Yes, welcome everybody. Just for a change, since it's the last show, I'm not going to say who I am. We've done 20 episodes and we've released one special since January, and we would like to thank Jimmy and Shane and Joe and Sam and everybody at Kerberos Media for giving us the opportunity to do this. They do a great job putting out a range of fascinating programs on a shoestring budget, and we're definitely friends of Kerberos Media, and you never know, we might be back sometime. But we were never going to do this indefinitely. And at least for a while, we need to focus on some other things. I'm on teaching and writing, because we've got these new courses, as some of you know, and if we haven't got anything for people to study, we're going to be in trouble. And Gabby on administration and campaigning. We've never seen ourselves as competing with the many great MMT podcasts out there. So I'm going to do something else different. I'm going to advertise everybody else's podcast. You should be listening to Joe Firestone, Jeff Epstein, Steve Grumbing, Christian Riley and Patricia Pino, Scottonomics, and the person whose T-shirt I'm wearing at the moment as well, Graham Elwood too, and a variety of other people. Compared to them, Gabby and I are rank amateurs, but we have got to speak briefly over the last 6 months to a long list of extraordinary people about issues broadly related to ecological economics and modern monetary theory, talking about everything from inflation to climate change to renewables to the right to repair. And all those shows are on both the Kerberos site and the Modern Money Lab site as well. And talking of extraordinary people, our final guest is the person who was also our very first guest on the first series, Fadhel. Fadhel Kaboub is one of, I'm not going to say the best MMT economists in the world, I'm going to say one of the best economists in the world, and the best person to talk to about modern monetary theory, ecological sustainability, and economic development. And thanks very much for coming on the show again, Fadhel.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Gabby, for hosting this series. It's a pleasure to be back.
It's been such a great experience, and we've talked to so many interesting people. I'm really I'm going to miss it, but yes, we are trying to put our energy into our postgraduate course program, which is going to be amazing. And just as a reminder for everybody, you can find out about that on our website, modernmoneylab.org.au. And if you have a look on the homepage, there's a link that will take you to more information about our courses. So please go and check that out. If you're thinking of studying, you can do even just one subject. Stephen and Phil Lawn will be teaching the 2 foundation subjects starting from September this year. So yeah, we have a lot to do, and we're very excited, and we're really happy with the progress so far. We've had over 100 people reach out to us and say they're interested in doing this, which is just amazing and really humbling as well.
All right, Gabby, let's get on the way.
Let's get on. Yep, sorry, that was the ad. Let's get on to Fadhel. Thank you. And Fadhel has been a big part of this too. You know, you've been so supportive of us. You've come to meetings with our university, Torrens University, and
yes, he got up in the middle of the night to come to a meeting, for which we are immensely grateful.
Anyway. So thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's start with Tanzania. So you've been in Tanzania. Can you tell us a bit about what you were working on there and what is going to be leading on from that trip?
So I was in Tanzania last week for a meeting co-hosted by PowerShift Africa, which is one of the most exciting climate NGOs on the continent. co-hosted by PowerShift Africa and CAN Tanzania. CAN stands for the Climate Action Network, which is a global international network, but this was the Tanzania chapter that hosted us there. And the purpose of the meeting was really to bring climate NGOs, climate negotiators from the African continent, and veterans in this space throughout the African continent, including some of the co-authors of the IPCC report, including the vice chair of the IPCC from Africa, Dr. Yuba Sekona, who's the vice chair of the IPCC from Mali, who was our elder and really the most senior person on the continent when it comes to these issues.
I think he invited you to participate, didn't he, Fadhel?
I'm sorry?
I think he invited you to participate.
Yes. So he and a small team of colleagues kind of picked a handful of people to come together to think about issues related to climate action, climate finance, and economic development. And as you all know, the failure of climate action, especially on the African continent and the global South, has been almost a failure by design, because every time we talk about climate action and climate finance, we neglect to even question the model of economic development or the economic model that most countries use. So the purpose of this meeting was really to bring together the issue of energy, the issue of climate action, and the issue of economic development all in one platform. And the goal was really to formulate a united narrative, a coherent narrative that we climate activists and NGOs and negotiators would embrace, and then hopefully succeed in convincing governments on the African continent to form a united front to tackle climate action, while at the same time questioning and modifying the engines of economic development on the African continent. And a big kind of elephant in the room when it comes to this issue is the question of fossil fuels, which has not been challenged so far in the last COP meeting. And we're hoping that it will be front and center on the table to have a global agreement to rapidly phase out the use of fossil fuels, which means having also a plan and a strategy to transition to alternative fuels, to help transition countries, especially countries in the global South that depend almost exclusively, in some cases, on exports of fossil fuels. So having a comprehensive strategy so that we're not just ending fossil fuels and then not having energy sources and not having engines of economic development in the global South. So that was really the purpose of the gathering. It was wonderful to meet like-minded people from all different disciplines and backgrounds, and have really meet with people who have the right intuition about economics, but don't necessarily have the economics that we've been talking about on this podcast in the MMT community when it comes to economic development with an MMT-informed perspective.
Yes, so important.
And as you know, being in Australia, there's an international movement that includes a lot of Canadians and Australians and Africans and people from all over the world to push for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And there is an initiative now that has thousands of signatories, including academics, Nobel laureates, the Dalai Lama. Dozens of cities around the world have already endorsed the treaty, diplomats from around the world. And our hope is that we will get this into the actual diplomatic space for heads of states to negotiate a treaty to phase out fossil fuels. And it's for a simple reason. Because when the United Nations Environmental Program a few years ago commissioned a study to look at where we stand in terms of fossil fuel plans of extraction versus what we as a globe can afford to extract, it turns out that what most countries are planning to extract and burn is about 140% of what we're actually allowed to do if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree limit.
Every fossil fuel company wants to squeeze the last drops out of this, and they are not prepared to let somebody else or give up something that can make them money.
Exactly. So basically, what we have right now, if we agree with the science, and it's been very clear from the last IPCC report that the science is very clear about what needs to be done if we were to meet our collective goal of leaving a planet that's livable for future generations and so on. That we're doing one of two things. We're either by continuing the extraction and the construction of more infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure, we're either signing a collective suicide pact, to be honest, or we're willingly creating stranded assets, and we're duping investors into spending hundreds of billions of dollars and holding on to assets that will become stranded assets if we actually get our act together and start phasing out fossil fuels. Either way, it's criminal, it's fraudulent, and it should be treated as such. And we have to be very honest about what needs to be done immediately.
Yeah.
And this is not just within African countries. This is African countries and other what people call developing countries, putting pressure on governments like the Australian government, for example. We're one of the world's biggest climate criminals, really, as a nation.
We're all in this together, so it's not going to be a few countries making it and others not. So it has to be this conversation has to take place in terms of what needs to be done immediately to phase out fossil fuels, and then what needs to be put in place so that we're not destroying economies and destroying people's livelihoods, so that we actually build resilient economies without fossil fuels. And that includes the research and development, that includes the transfer of technology to developing countries, that includes climate reparations, as in repairing damage with financial resources and with technological capabilities, and repairing the global financial architecture that's part of this problem, which means changing the mode of economic development, international trade, international finance. And unfortunately, these are issues that were on the table, not on the climate front, but on the economic and international trade and finance front when we were transitioning out of World War II. Keynes put this on the table immediately. And now, almost a century later, we're going back to repair the damage on the international trade and finance front because we need a better financial architecture for economic development, for a climate transition.
And
it's extraordinarily important.
If people are coming across these things for the first time, do you have a recommendation for how you can get your head around these issues? Do you have a book that you might recommend to people, or some talks that they might listen to? Because it's a lot to process if you're encountering these ideas without having that background.
Sure. So on the climate front, I think the best place to go right now would be the latest IPCC report, not the full report, which is thousands of pages, but the way the IPCC produces these reports is it's hundreds of climate scientists who actually review the literature and basically summarize it for the UN to say, this is what the science says about climate change, what caused it, and what are the consequences, and what the models are telling us about the future if we continue on this particular path, and what are some of the possibilities. So they're not really saying anything new. They're just summarizing all the literature in one big document. But then they take that giant document and they write an executive summary for policymakers, which is about 20, 30 pages, which is a document that most people read, and that's the one that you want to read. And what's so exciting about that document is that every single line, every single word, every single comma is negotiated and approved by all member states. So whatever you see in that document, you can hold your government accountable because they agreed to it. And they spend hours and hours and days negotiating every single sentence in it. And what's so exciting about this last IPCC report, the summary for policymakers, is that it doesn't use any vague language anymore about climate
No.
change. It's not about likelihood and possibility. It's unequivocal language about what causes climate change, what the consequences of inaction are, and lays out some of the, it's not a document that kind of imposes on countries what needs to be done, but almost kind of makes it so obvious that what needs to be done. And that's what we're hoping will be spelled out in the next COP meeting in Egypt this November, is explicitly having an understanding that without phasing out fossil fuels on a rapid schedule, we're going to be in big trouble. And that's really the big push for the next thing. So for people to be informed, that's probably the best place to start. But in terms of academic literature and websites, there's plenty of other resources. We can add some of them to the show notes here, including Doughnut Economics, including Project Drawdown, lots of other, very accessible literature about climate action and what needs to be done.
Absolutely. Project Drawdown is something that we haven't really talked about on this show very much, but that may be something that we can explore a bit more in the future. I think that sounds like a great plan. Yes. I was just thinking. There's a
website that goes with the book, by the way, projectdrawdown.org maybe, or something like that.
Excellent. Yeah, have a look. I was thinking about a novel that somebody gave me for Christmas, I think 2 years ago, called The Ministry for the Future. And if you are a person who loves fiction, this is speculative fiction, so looking ahead into the future and based on the science and technology and the politics that we have now, how we might find ourselves a pathway out of this mess. I really enjoyed the book. I think it touches on a lot of things like rewilding. It brings MMT into the story. I thought that was a great book to be able to understand the steps that we need to take, but in an approach that is like a fictional. So you identify with the characters and you can see yourself in this world.
The author has been interviewed on a podcast I didn't mention. I can't remember the name of now, but by Scott Ferguson. I should remember the name of it. It's very interesting. That's right. Money on the Left. Tim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. And actually it has, for me, what made me think about that book again was recently the extreme temperatures in India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
Because there is an extraordinarily extreme, frightening climate event at the beginning of that book, which happens in India and starts the whole narrative going. Talking of, just sort of moving on slightly, but only very slightly, to climate is a crisis which is with us all the time, but a crisis which is particularly severe this year. Of course, it's not just climate change, but also COVID and particularly the Ukrainian war, exacerbated by a big increase in food price speculation on Euronext and other exchanges around the world. But we are at the moment living through a period of rapid growth in the price of food, and countries that are dependent on food imports particularly are in a very difficult set of circumstances at the moment, and perhaps over the next few months and year, hundreds of millions of people who would not normally be extremely food insecure are going to be facing that sort of situation where they don't have enough food, where they run out of food. And this ties in, I think, to Fadhel's discussion, which he explained so many times, of the importance of food sovereignty. How are those African countries where you were talking to some of the diplomats and politicians? How are they facing up to this challenge at the moment?
Well, unfortunately, everything you described is actually in motion right now, with the massive increase in food prices and actual shortages, because we have to recognize that none of the shipments out of Ukraine have actually made it out. Very few have made it out, and it looks like logistically it's extremely difficult to reroute Ukrainian exports using rail, for example, just because of the rail size is actually not compatible with neighboring countries. So it's going to be very slow transition. So again, a peaceful resolution to the conflict will help ease this tension. But on top of the actual shortages and the higher prices, what we're seeing is all the future prices, 6 months forward, all of those contracts are sky high. Central banks around the world, especially the Fed, raising interest rates, that makes the cost of borrowing, the cost of financing, the debt of the global South even more painful. So we're looking at a potential global South debt crisis for a handful of countries, at least in the next few years. We're looking also at energy prices, which gets into the cost of shipping, the cost of pumping water for irrigation, the cost of fertilizers. All of this doesn't really bode well for global food prices, at least for the next 6 months. Even if everything stops today and we restore peace and everything else, a lot of those costs have been locked in already. So and this is something that is really the result of the global economy having been reorganized since the 1960s, more or less, to have only a handful of major producers of wheat, corn, soybean around the planet, and that happened in the aftermath of independence of most of the countries in the global South. Europe in particular looked around and said, well, we're not going to depend, our livelihood is not going to depend on all of these former colonies. We need to restore food sovereignty on the continent. And that was the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which was designed to heavily subsidize European farmers to produce food, core staples, at a fraction of the cost almost of what farmers in the global South were able to do. And as a result, producers of wheat and corn and soybean and most other countries in the global South couldn't compete. So they switched to other crops, cash crops, and they started importing wheat and corn and soybean and sunflower seeds from these major blocks that formed, because it wasn't just Europe. The US did the same, Japan did the same, Australia did the same, and the Soviet Union at the time, which is Russia and the Ukraine today. So those are the main producers of all of these commodities. And when two of them get into a conflict, Russia and the Ukraine, we have major disruptions. So that's why we're talking about the concept of food security is nice and all, but it doesn't really work in these situations. So
you add it to a drought in Brazil and parts of the US and China, it just makes the situation even worse.
And now you see a situation where some of the smaller, mid-sized type of exporters are worrying about their own food security, and they're imposing bans on exports. India started doing this in 2008. We've seen Brazil and Russia and other countries banning exports of key commodities. So
and they have to do that for political reasons too. Like if the current government is facing an election, it's a very populist thing to do.
Yeah. So all of these things are a good reminder that we should rethink this massive kind of globalization, that the kind of globalization that we've pursued since the 1960s. To be honest, we've gone way too far, and we've pursued this lean and mean supply chain, kind of just-in-time supply chain. Now we need to think about just-in-case supply chains. Now we need to think in terms of resilience. Now we need to think in terms of protecting people from these external shocks, which means investing in food sovereignty. Actually, food sovereignty doesn't mean you have money to buy food. Food sovereignty means you actually have the entire production process, from seeds to irrigation to logistics and distribution, all the way to the final consumer, with the intent of producing affordable food, supporting farmers who actually produce the food, as opposed to supporting the middlemen who extract from the production process.
Pretty much what the Europeans did anyway, and then stopped everybody else doing.
Exactly. It's actually very interesting to hear the French Minister of Agriculture in the last few weeks commenting on the situation and calming down the public in France, saying, "Don't worry, we have our food sovereignty. We've done this since the 1950s. We've invested in it. So this is not us. This is the other countries that have troubles." So it tells me that the country, as a matter of public policy, knows exactly what they've done and why they've done it, but prevents other countries from doing it. So we need to rethink what we've done to the global economy, not just in terms of food, but energy and so many other things.
What are the chances of getting European, American, Australian governments of that kind who, at the moment, they might not formally dominate the World Trade Organization, but actually they do really, as well as, of course, all the multilateral trade agreements they have between themselves. And they are all, to a greater or lesser extent, subject to state capture by vested interest. What's the chances of actually persuading policymakers in these countries to go along with reviewing, as we desperately need to do, the whole relationship between the so-called global north and the global south, and trade agreements and everything, really?
Yeah. Well, it's like moving mountains, because we really have to push on all fronts. So people in the global north, that is the public, has to contribute to this by pushing policymakers to do the right thing and really be able to call their bluff when they're saying we're trying to help. You're not helping if you're not really repairing the damage, if you're not tackling the issue of fossil fuels, if you're not tackling the issue of food sovereignty and energy sovereignty in the global south, if you're pursuing extractive economic relationships with the global south, you're not helping, you're contributing to the problem. So we need policymakers to understand this, and we need activist NGOs and constituents in the global north to do this. But also in the global south, we need to have the grassroots NGO organizations, civil society, and policymakers recognize that they're actually engaging in that relationship. Because in many cases, they see international trade and foreign direct investment and tourism, for example, as a positive contribution from the global north. So we have to...
The flow is the other way around. The global south supports the global north.
You're reminding me of another book now, which is The Divide by Jason Hickel, which would be a great book to read. Yes.
Yeah. So the key answer to your question, Stephen, is really informing and educating and mobilizing and organizing people so that we can actually push back against the dominant narrative, so that we have a chance at actually changing the system. It's not enough to be angry at the system or angry at politicians, but we have to be able to articulate why the system is not working and be able to demonstrate that a better path is actually within reach, that we're not talking about an impossible system where, there'll be, some countries will gain and other countries will lose. What we're describing here is a system in which everybody will thrive, that will provide resilience to everybody, that will allow us to phase out fossil fuels and transition to a healthier, more sustainable society. This morning, a colleague shared with me a link to a story that just came out from Deloitte, the consulting firm, They did a study looking at the cost of climate inaction, and I don't remember the exact number right now, but I think they estimated something like $170 trillion for the next 50 years if there's no action, which is the equivalent of 2 years worth of global GDP in today's dollars, basically.
Yeah.
So and these are really conservative estimates. Well, we're not talking about some radical organization that's really trying to inflate the numbers. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about convincing the public and policymakers that the cost of doing nothing is much, much larger than the cost of doing the right thing, which is what we've been advocating.
That's a good place, I think, for us to finish the series. So I would like to thank Fadhel and Stephanie and others for providing the kind of leadership that we need to inspire us all to get behind that campaign. And I just really finish by saying I've been involved on the edges of the MMT group, I suppose, for a few years now, and I have seen it change. And I've seen the nature of the discussion by activists, including people like Steve Grumbine, who talks a lot about this now, change as well. I stood up in a room not all that many years ago and talked about some of these things, and had the audience quite hostile, actually. But that has all changed now, and a lot of the change is down to you, Fadhel. So I would like to profoundly thank you for that, and thank you for being on the last episode on our series of Modern Money Doughnuts.
Well, thank you very much. You're way too generous, and you're way too humble about your contribution to this effort. And again, for both of you and everybody in Australia, congratulations on the success of civil society, of really pushing to nudge the political system in the right direction and put climate action at the center of the political process.
We'll give Gabby's friend and former colleague, Senator, as she now is, Barbara Pocock of the Greens, a mention as well. It was great to see her elected to Canberra, and I can't wait to see what difference she makes to our national contribution.
Yes. Congratulations to the Greens who got elected. And yeah, it's just it's such a big relief now to know that at least the adults are in charge. And, you know, Australia is no longer a global embarrassment, or hopefully won't be. And, you know, we've got a long way to go, of course, with getting both large parties in Australia to commit to a non-proliferation of fossil fuels. Both of them are still interested in opening up new coal mines and new gas. So we've got still more work to do, but yeah, we're in a much better place. And and I think absolutely, Fadhel, I remember the first time I heard you give a talk, I was just blown away by how much I learned just in like an hour. It was amazing. It completely changed my views. And thank you for being part of this show. And hopefully we'll see you again soon, perhaps on our Modern Money Lab courses launch. That would be exciting, coming up in a few months. And yeah, we'll definitely keep in touch. And thank you for being part of our podcast and for rounding it out with us.
And thanks again to Kerberos Media, and keep watching their shows. They're great.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks again, Fadhel. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.